They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
Welcome back to Best Day Ever, episode number 8. I'm joined with Adam Martin as always. Hey, Adam, how are you doing?
Good morning, everybody. Super excited to get this show started.
Yeah, we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to be touching upon some fake news updates from mainstream media, also Danielle Smith and what's going on in Alberta. We're going to be touching upon the recent discussions with Pfizer and whether they actually essentially whether they knew or not that it was going to reduce transmission when it comes to the COVID virus. We're also going to touch upon the Bank of England's game of chicken. I think there's actually just a lot to unpack here. I'm excited to jump into it. But before we do that, any quick updates that you wanted to share with people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be moving up to the Citadel soon, so you guys might even see Matt and I in the same set very soon, and just arranging some moving for that. And just a heads up, I actually won't be here next week, so you guys are going to be in store for something different next week, and I think Matt's got some really fun programming ready for you for that.
Yeah. And let's jump into some of our WTF stories for the day. These are going to really circle around the concept of fake news. So let's pull it up here. This first one really frustrates me, and I'll get into it in a second, but this is from Rebel News. Global News Rachel Gilmore publishes breaking fake news about Elon Musk. The misinformation from Canada's self-appointed fake news fighter was published on Twitter about an hour after the premise of the story was debunked. So obviously, Rebel News is going to go hard at Global News, and particularly Rachel Gilmore here. She's regularly had kind of a Twitter spat with the Fairies Tolman, which you guys will remember from last week's Wednesday episode, where we got into culture jamming. So she's regularly kind of the butt of a lot of Ferryman's jokes and the butt of a lot of his like fake news doctored articles. Now, what this actually relates to is she was claiming, and it appears that she essentially just kind of copy pasted from a Vice article that knew Elon Musk spoke to Putin before tweeting Russia-Ukraine peace plan. So obviously there's big consequences here if this was actually true, right? If Elon Musk actually reached out to Putin, got his input, then posted on Twitter something that seemed like it was trying to bring all parties to the table, that would seem kind of nefarious. And I think that that would really be cause for concern for a lot of individuals and cause for concern for a lot of Elon Musk fanboys. However, the moment this broke on Vice News, Elon Musk came out and said, nope, I've only spoken to Putin once. It was 18 months ago and had to do with space programs and traveling to space. What really frustrates me about this is that tweet was available before she published her article. And so afterwards, she came back and said, Elon Musk is disputing this or denies it. And even that framing makes it sound like it's actually still reasonable to think that he's actually, that this actually played out in real life. And I think Ian Mile Chong from the Post Millennial, leaned into this. So you ripped off the Vice report and didn't do any fact checking of your own or get comment from Elon Musk. And yeah, that's pretty much what she did here. And now, again, that's not necessarily that different if you're just reporting other people's news, but there's something to it when you really frame it as original reporting. And essentially, I think a lot of people still, wrongly in my opinion, trust global news. And so they're naturally going to trust an article that comes out from Rachel Gilmore, particularly because she's the one constantly calling out fake news, or at least fake news from her perspective. So if you go further down in the Rebel News article, you'll see different highlights from her in regards to, fake news that she tried to debunk. So again, like tweets like, this is misinformation and disinformation looks like when it infects enough people, this is the power it has. It's a threat to democracy. And a lot of critics of Rachel are naturally going to jump in here and use this as an opportunity to dunk on her. I really do think that this was just poor decision making on her part and wanting to get the clickbait headline, right? Because that is clickbaity as hell. If Elon Musk is privately essentially talking or negotiating with Putin and trying to, bring together a peaceful resolution to the current conflict in Ukraine. But turns out that appears to be not based in any sort of evidence whatsoever. And I guess anything you want to add on this story, Adam, before rolling into the CBC?
Well, I just think it's particularly punitive to anybody that's also not just plugged in 24/7, right? Because a tweet like this is going to be liked, reshared, and spread all over the internet. And if you go away for a day from the internet, or even 5 seconds at the speed we move on Twitter, you may not actually have an opportunity to catch this other side of the story, in that he never actually had that conversation. And so I think it's particularly damaging for anybody that's just not going to have their finger right on the pulse, which is understandable, right? I mean, we live in a very fast paced time. Like we just reviewed on my show yesterday, I'm getting thousands of notifications per day. I might miss this one. So I think that this type of journalism is actually more dangerous than it even appears on its face, because okay, so she said something and we can disprove it. So that's good. So maybe it's not that bad. But the problem is that not everybody's going to hear the rebuttal. So I think that that's where this gets out of hand.
Yeah, and to not reach out to Elon or check his Twitter feed before posting the article, I personally find very telling. Talking about the frustratingness around fake news, though, this one from the Western Standard, CBC's ombudsman says company aired in connecting Freedom Convoy to Russia. So, a CBC News claim that falsely suggested Russia was behind Freedom Convoy protesters should have been caught before broadcast, says the network's ombudsman. The claim by announcer Nil Kausal was unattributed and made without evidence. There was no concrete evidence, wrote Jack Nagler. I'm disappointed it took others to point out that CBC's question was off, he added. And so what's really frustrating about this is this perpetual cycle of misinformation coming out from the government, in my opinion. So particularly with this story, what we had was CBC essentially blindly speculating that Russia was probably involved because Russia's bad, and we know the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters are bad, or at least Justin Trudeau told us they're bad. So, two bad people naturally know each other, are naturally interlinked. And again, we heard this about foreign donors, and it turned out not to be the case whatsoever, right? Like 90% of the contributions to the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest were from Canadians. And yet we had these constant articles in mainstream news. Now, again, you might take that at face value and be like, well, that's frustrating, but it is what it is. But again, understand that CBC is directly funded by the government. But then what happens is politicians go into parliament, they highlight these articles from CBC News, use it as proof and justification for why they need to enact things like the Emergencies Act. And we end up with the cyclical logic of Justin Trudeau called them racist and misogynist. The news reported that they're racist and misogynist. Therefore, Justin Trudeau can reference the news in Parliament, proving that they're racist and misogynist. The same happened with the Nazi story that we talked about yesterday, right? CSIS, the Canadian spy agency, said, we think it's overstated. It hasn't been, captured by or infiltrated by the Canadian Nazi movement. Not that there is even a very large Canadian Nazi movement in the first place, but they're not directly associated with the Freedom Trucker Convoy. We're not concerned about it. There's been additional reports coming out over the last 24 hours that again indicate that the government agencies and politicians should have known. If they didn't know, they were willfully blind to this in regards to what the actual facts on the ground were, right? CSIS even said in a memo and report they had no concerns about the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest. And that was as of February 14th, which was the day, reminder, when we actually enacted the Emergencies Act here in Canada. And so, again, this is just, there won't be real consequences to the CBC here. There won't be real consequences to the politicians that reference the CBC. And the cycle is just going to continue on and on. But I at least wanted to highlight this just to, if for no other reason, to assure myself that I'm not crazy. Any thoughts on this, Adam?
Yeah, it's that circle, that vicious circle of them reporting it, then it gets used as a reference material and being seen as legitimate. That's so unfair. And it's just wild that if you're on the wrong side of the narrative, it's also you that's paying for this stuff, right? This is your tax dollars paying for the thing that incriminates itself and then uses that as evidence against you. to me, it's a befuddling situation. So I don't think I have anything valuable to say about it, just other than, griping.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say again is I think we can expect more of the same in regards to this from mainstream media, and it's so important why all of us do our own due diligence, be our own fact checkers, and it's very easy to get caught up in the emotions of a narrative, right? And I'm just as culpable or capable of it as anyone else is, but we need to start really holding journalists to a different standard. And we need to really consider whether we should be funding these organizations to the tune of hundreds of millions, in the CBC's case, billions of dollars over the last couple of years. Before we jump into the main stories of the day, just wanted to check in, see if you had any recommendations for the audience, Adam. I wanted to quickly recommend the Timcast IRL. If you guys haven't checked it out, to me, it's one of the closest things to must-view television that I've got. It's obviously a YouTube channel, a live stream that happens at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, weekday, daily. And for me, like, again, it's not, I don't catch every single episode, but it's one of the few shows that, like, I try and catch the vast majority of them. Again, it's in line with, like, what you'll see from Russell Brand, from Jimmy Dore, and things of that nature. Again, I think between the three of them, they're doing some of the best, like, reporting / regurgitating of the facts in the news, and they're willing to shine the light on any and all perspectives in regards to it, as long as it's fact-based. Any recommendations?
Yeah, that's awesome, Matt. And I definitely second that recommendation. But my recommendation today is going to be mostly entertainment only. And so I actually just watched this documentary on Netflix called Aftershock, Everest and the Nepal earthquake. And I found it to be very interesting. I mean, I'm inspired by the people that want to challenge themselves to that level of physical challenge. And the people that do that have a certain characteristic, a certain set of qualities to them. And one thing that was really cool in this documentary is, and if you guys aren't aware, Nepal had this like epic earthquake in 2015, and it ended up making about 3.5 million people homeless, and it killed several thousand. I think it was 3,000 or 6,000. It was a lot of people. But anyways, this documentary goes through real active footage of some of the climbers, because it's a sport you would film. And anyways, I found it very gripping. It was a very emotional documentary, but it was also interesting to see how people in that mindset, the people that are capable of climbing something like Everest, how they exactly reacted to this type of emergency, and how fast they were able to mobilize and take command and control of the situation, and leverage great communication skills in order to save lives that would have otherwise been lost. And I think there's really something to take away from that documentary in studying that. But other than that, very visually appealing documentary and quite interesting. And my hair's just stood up because it actually is quite a roller coaster. So an interesting watch.
Nice. We'll definitely check that out, guys. What's not on my radar. Jumping into the first story of the day, I really wanted to just kind of explore what's going on with Danielle Smith. If you guys haven't been paying attention, she recently was just elected as the Premier of Alberta here, one of the provinces in Canada. And it seems like we're going to get a very different narrative out of her and the UCP party versus what we were used to with Jason Kenney. And so first thing I'm going to start you guys off with is this video clip. If you haven't already heard it, it's probably a sign that you're not really plugged into Canadian politics, because this was just everywhere for a while. And it is fascinating because this goes against the mainstream narrative that we've heard over the last couple of years.
The community that faced the most restrictions on their freedoms in the last year were those who made a choice not to be vaccinated. I don't think I've ever experienced a situation in my lifetime where a person was fired from their job, or not allowed to watch their kids play hockey, or not allowed to go visit a loved one in long-term care or hospital, or not allowed to go get on a plane to either go across the country to see family or even travel across the border. So they have been the most discriminated against group that I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. That's a pretty extreme level of discrimination that we have seen. I don't take away any of the discrimination that I've seen in those other groups that you mentioned, but this has been an extraordinary time in the last year in particular. And I want people to know that I find that unacceptable, that we are not going to create a segregated society on the basis of a medical choice.
So obviously this is a bold statement for a politician in Canada in particular to be making. There's a lot of things I actually want to explore in regards to this. First of all, I just find it refreshing. This doesn't feel like, she was careful with her language, but it also feels like she was telling the truth as she sees fit. And again, whether you agree or disagree with her, there's something very it's a pattern interrupt for me to hear someone speak so openly and honestly. And I want to kind of explore the argument or the point she was trying to make here, because I saw a lot of people on mainstream media immediately wanting to, pitchfork and torture in regards to this, right? Because this does not fit in with the nice packaging they've had on the COVID narrative over the last couple of years. Now, immediately people are like, what about Indigenous people? What about Black people? What about, any and all minorities? They're discriminated against more than vaccinated people. And if you were to go through, honestly, the thought exercise of what would happen if an Indigenous person, a Black person, or another visible minority was fired for their job because they were Indigenous, Black, or visible minority? What if they weren't allowed to travel on public transportation? What if, right? If you apply all that, it becomes very apparent that, oh, wait, yeah, that would actually be the story of the century if here in Canada we weren't allowing Black people on airplanes. That would just it would be we'd be talked about 24/7 in all Western media in that regards. And now again, when you think about systemic racism, right, or systemic discrimination, there's nothing much more systemic than the government from a top-down level dictating these sort of policies and enforcing private corporations and other entities to enact these, right? Like I'm very happy that she's speaking out like this. I'm honestly a little surprised that she's being so blunt with her language, because honestly, even a year ago, this feels like it probably would be political suicide. But it gives me hope that we might start to really see real thought-provoking, engaging conversation around this subject matter. Because up until kind of this discussion, and we'll see how the Emergencies Act inquiry that's going on this week starting tomorrow plays out, but it's very easy to get blackpilled and think there'll never be any consequences to the individuals that implemented a lot of these draconian policies against their own population out of the fear or out of the belief that, better safe than sorry. What are your thoughts here, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, hearing this statement made me want to just clap my hands. And I think that Canadian politicians in particular have this very soft, left of center type outward view on almost everything. And even when they claim to be hardcore conservatives, they always leave that back door to escape from, in saying that, yeah, but we had to save everybody, right? Yeah, but this was for the better of everybody's health or whatever. And it's well, that's not what the data showed. And what this lady just said to you is so accurate. And I think your points about not being able to get on a plane, not being able to maintain your employment, not being able to go and see your kids have a hockey game or travel to visit your family. If you subjected any other class or group of people to that, or race, there would literally be riots in the streets and they would burn everything down. And I am still unbelievably inspired by the average Canadian person who is able to go and rally to the level that they did and the level of peace that they exercised during that freedom convoy, because there was almost no violence. There was almost nothing that got out of hand. And that is honestly unprecedented for the amount of people that were involved with that movement. And I would have expected something much more violent, given the amount of distrust, the amount of abrasion, the amount of just tyranny that we saw, right? They were actively calling you a racist, misogynist, fringe minority when we knew that that wasn't true. And so I think the othering of our society has been extremely dangerous and extremely harmful to our society and culture. But I do think that movements like this, or a statement like this, is going to give way to some of what we're seeing already in the States, right? Which is political tourism, right? Where you're going to go and you're going to potentially move from a California over to a Texas or Florida. And I think that this is something that we might experience here in Canada, where people are going to go, hey, this lady's talking to me right now, right? She's actually standing up, and perhaps being the only one to stand up for me in the last couple of years. And I know as soon as I heard this, I was like, well, that's it. I have to move to Alberta. Less taxes, their politics align with mine. And this is a statement that I can get behind, compared to listen to Uncle Doug or Trudeau over here just punishing us time after time after time and then charging us to do it. And I think that that's extremely disenfranchising. So really happy to see this, Matt. And to your point, I'm shocked as well that we're heading into the winter. I was very much expecting a whole COVID campaign to roll out regarding flu season and the cold weather and et cetera. And to see her take this position right now, I find to be very optimistic, and I'm excited for this, Matt.
Yeah, it definitely is refreshing and different, if nothing else, in regards to the political discourse we've essentially received up until this point in time. We're also seeing her push other initiatives and I think really looking to take back control of Alberta and try and make the province the driver of a lot of policy versus always deferring to the federal government. We're also seeing Scott Moe of Saskatchewan. He's stepping up and kind of speaking out in regards to some of the pollution laws being enacted from the federal top-down perspective as well. So I think that, honestly, I think that a lot of Canadians will underestimate the significance of what's playing out right now in Western Canada. I don't know what the long-term consequences are, but I think we are going to continue to see a greater polarization in regards to politics between West and East, or between the coast and the middle of Canada. And time will tell how this all plays out. But I guess one thing I want to quickly just kind of recap or remind all of us in regards to the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest, because with the passage of time, I think it's really easy for people to be like, well, they did do some crazy shit. And it's like, no, let's actually really break down, as you were saying, just how peaceful that protest was. The biggest controversies around it, right? Quick reminder, there was the claim of arson. That's been completely disproven. That person was not associated in any way. If anything, it seems like a false flag operation where the individual was purposely trying to get Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters in trouble. Then we had the Terry Fox statue. The protesters dared put on a flag on Terry Fox, and I think he even had a hat on as well. So that was one of the big controversies. We had the lady that danced on the unknown soldier's grave, right? But again, not really that extreme in the big scheme of protests or civil disobedience. And outside of that, we had the claim that people were sometimes honking their horns at night. And that's about the gist of the biggest controversies around it, other than the fact that there was an individual that waved a Nazi flag, one individual. So again, to think that thousands of people descended upon our nation's capital and were able to act in such a peaceful manner, again, really does deserve props, as you highlighted. One last point on the Danielle Smith thing that I just wanted to highlight here, an opinion piece from Rex Murphy. Danielle Smith isn't threatening our Confederation. She may be saving it. The only thing I can find wrong about the new Alberta Premier's approach is how long it took her to be undertaken. So honestly, this article, there's really not much meat to it, but I did want to highlight this one paragraph here. Now, I could argue that in a post-national state with no core values, as Canada famously was described by one of the Constitution's keenest students, that it is the provinces that hold majority sway. For if there is no center, no core, then obviously the outliers are the only possible source of strength. I just thought that was an important point to kind of make here in this discussion, because I think that we'll see the movements of both Scott Moe as well as Danielle Smith giving rise to other premiers speaking out. And I don't think that they're all going to speak out in agreement with the two Western provinces. I think that we'll probably see BC and Ontario particularly double down on their own narratives of a safety first sort of perspective and the nanny state. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that because I think we're about to see the political discourse in Canada get a lot more polarized, and I don't think a lot of people are expecting it. I think that we're going to very quickly see ourselves on the level of polarization like in America has kind of experienced post-2022 election.
I agree, but the one thing I do think too that really helps her is that her delivery of this also feels different than what we've been seeing for the last couple of years. Like I have felt personally, and this is just, again, anecdotal, I have felt attacked by our government when they're saying I'm a misogynist, racist, terrorist of a fringe minority, right? And this lady's coming out and I'm looking at a sincere, heartfelt, almost like mother figure making this statement, right? And like, she's calmly saying it. She's not grandstanding. She's not using her body to distract you. She's not using some of the clever Obama politician talking techniques that just get you all amped up. And it doesn't feel divisive. It feels like she's just stating the fact that it has been a problem for us and we're not going to continue doing it. And I think that is just an excellent delivery. And I think that it's going to make the choice to do the delivery in this way of this message, I believe, is going to not make it simple for the pitchforks and torches. I don't think it's going to be easy to attack her. I think it's going to be like, no, she said her piece and it sounded truthful and sincere. And she wasn't trying to say like, okay, now we rally against the vaccinated. It's like, no, it's just, let's stop harassing and discriminating against those people that have been discriminated against.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with you there, Adam. I do kind of disagree. I think we're going to see mainstream media really go after her. I think we'll see Justin Trudeau and, like I said, the premiers of BC and Ontario in particular go after her, simply because she's going to be like the only individual, it appears, point blank stating the emperor's wearing no clothes. And I think they're too pot committed at this point in time, right? Like, think of all this CBC, Global News, CTV News journalists that have been fear mongering for the last 2 years, right? Think about the Toronto Star with their front page cover of like, should we really tolerate the unvaccinated? And obviously, we won't rehash all the crazy shit Justin Trudeau has said about the unvaccinated. But I think at this point in time, the idea of reconciliation here is going to be a very difficult pill for them to swallow. I think the most we could hope from those individuals, honestly, is for them to just kind of fade that narrative and move on. I don't think that we're ever going to see an apology. I don't think we'll ever see them admit any sort of fault. And while that's extremely frustrating, I hope that we continue to see, speeches from Danielle Smith giving more confidence and credence to other individuals who would dare go against the mainstream narrative. Switching gears, though, and jumping into the second story of the day we wanted to explore with you guys. This is from the Mises Institute. College as an economic and social problem, dealing with the culture. And I just thought this was kind of an interesting conversation. This is part one of a 4-part series, so we're obviously not going to cover everything here, but there were a few chunks of this I really wanted to just kind of highlight. So Jeff Dice recently posed the question, is college worth it? My first thought when I opened the article was that he could have reduced the entire piece to a single word, no. And, my hot take, if I was trying to be bombastic, I would completely agree with that. Now, the ever-sober Dice, of course, did not simply make a blanket argument that higher education is never worth it. Rather, he acknowledged the important reality that however far the university system has fallen, society still needs at least some of what college programs offer. Most people would prefer that engineers designing our bridges and doctors operating on us have some formal training and major in STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field, tend to correspond to higher incomes for graduates. In other words, market signals still show that there is value in at least some degrees. And I definitely agree with that perspective, but there was a couple of different segments he kind of broke out and explored this argument in. So the first one, education and economic mobility. The most basic problem facing higher education today is the plummeting value of a bachelor's degree. Undergraduate students face increasing tuition costs, often covered by sizable student loans, to earn degrees that in many cases no longer provide any advantage on the job market. This is basic economics. More demand for access to college leads to higher priced tuition, while greater supply of college graduates leads to declining prices in post-college salaries. The fall in market value also corresponds to a decline in the quality of education, as professors often rubber stamp students through courses, chipping away at the value signal degrees are supposed to convey. And this has definitely been my personal anecdotal experience, and I don't think I'm alone in this, that as you continue to see the cost of post-secondary education increase, the real net value of it, right, if you were to look at like a net present value of it, becomes harder and harder to justify outside of a handful of those different degrees, like in the STEM fields. The next main point here, the college experience. And this is regularly an argument you'll hear modern day, is that, the certain level of socializing and maturity that occurs through the college experience. But as first generation graduates gave way to second and third generation students, something started to change. College became an experience. University enrollment swelled with the maturation of baby boomers, many of whom, enmeshed in hippie culture, graduated with more than a diploma. They left with memories of an active social life full of dalliances, experimentation, and liberation. Most outgrew this lifestyle, and their degree still had market value, but college had become more than an instrument for increasing somebody's earning potential. They remembered, perhaps too fondly, their youthful excursions and used the prospects of such experiences to encourage their own children to look forward to college. And while I do believe there's a certain validity there, right? A lot of individuals, relatively speaking, were more coddled in grade school and high school, and going off to have that college experience often is like a broad new horizon to explore. However, the idea of like essentially financially shackling yourself to the extreme levels of financial debt that are associated with a post-secondary education these days, I think has really tipped the cost benefit analysis in regards to that experience. And then finally, the last point here is school is your job. Little thought was given to the opportunity cost of the college experience. Not all parents embraced the ethos that school was their child's job until they graduated college, but many accepted this logic uncritically. That our children could afford not to work was thought one of the luxuries of modern middle class life, and too many parents failed to consider that work is a form of education in and of its own right. I think that last point is extremely valuable, right? You'll often hear that those that can't teach. And the whole concept there is that individuals that can't actually execute, that aren't capable of just like putting in the work, putting in the effort, making the sacrifices, will often find themselves, compelled or drawn towards academia and perpetual studying, whether that's upgrading to a master's, a PhD, or whatever higher form of education. So I just thought this was a useful and important conversation to have in regards to what's going on with the post-secondary institutions. Obviously, you've got guys like Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs and things like that for a long time, pushing the narrative that there's alternatives if you're really focused on just trying to increase your earning potential by going after the trades, right? By looking towards types of labor that are maybe a little bit more physical in nature and more like, technician oriented versus simply always looking towards the educated class or towards the knowledge class based fields. So, what's your general thoughts here, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what was said here. I do think it would be naive to think that everybody should be a business owner or everybody should skip the degree and just go out and get practical knowledge and that will lead them down the best or most optimal path in life. I do think student debt's a very, very real hindrance, and particularly like we don't even touch what the Americans are doing, right? Because some of their education can be up in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. My personal experience with education was very positive. I was able to go to a college, which is kind of different here in Canada than what you might have in America. So we have universities and colleges being more like a practical type learning environment. And so I went to a college that was offering a degree. So essentially got a university education at a college, which offered co-op programs and a lot of like very practical knowledge compared to perhaps some of my peers at like a Laurier or a Western University here, which are Ivy League schools. So I have a very unique experience in my education where I was able to first learn about true mentorship through my college because my profs were real, serious people. My operations management prof was like he used to do major consulting projects for companies like Tim Hortons regarding their logistics or Magna Corp regarding their operations management issues when they were trying to produce products with less product faults. And Toyota, he's done a lot of work for, and Porsche in Germany. So like, having access to this human at my age was invaluable. I mean, you could never access this guy otherwise without that education. And so I think I was able to leverage it. But in the same breath, I think a lot of people think that it's better to go and get a degree than do nothing. And I don't think that that's true. I think some of these psych degrees, some of these degrees in like social science where people are literally never going to use them, I think that's a big opportunity cost compared to getting an education from something like a specialized course, right? In the time and that we live in, where there's so much education available online or through mentors or through people that are offering courses and programs through things like YouTube or Masterclass. Like, you could go and learn from them, start your job at sort of a minimum wage and work your way up, gaining those real life skills. And I think that is seriously powerful, but I don't think we can discount higher education right away. And you brought up the STEM fields, right? Which if you're listening, you don't actually know what that is. That's science, technology, engineering, and maths. Obviously, you need your doctor to have formal training. I mean, that would be ridiculous not to. And you brought up engineers, right? You want your bridge to actually work. So I'm of two minds on that, but I do agree that student debt can be absolutely paralyzing, particularly given that there's no way to get rid of it, right? You can go bankrupt and clear out a lot of your other consumer debts, but you cannot get rid of your student debt. And I think that's a very scary system. And I think the public system's a little bit creepy too, because it's subsidized by the government, and then the government because it's subsidized by the government, more people do it, so it becomes more expensive because they need more infrastructure and profs. So I think that's a self-fulfilling, bloated government system as well, which probably should be addressed.
Mm-hmm. I guess one point I would make on that is, outside of fields where certification's necessary in order to essentially practice your craft. So again, like where, a doctor, you need the DR in front of your name, or like an accountant or a lawyer or other fields like that. I think my preference would always be towards experience versus education if we were debating that. And honestly, even in the realm of certification, I would much rather see it be competency oriented versus education oriented. And by that, I mean, like, whether it's a practical test, right? Whether it's proof, whether it's through like mentorship or apprenticeship or something of that nature. I still fundamentally believe that experience will trump education like 9 times out of 10 in just about any field of practice. Now, when we're looking at specifically like engineers or doctors, again, the path of least resistance based upon our existing system is to have that education certification. But I think in a preferable world, you would see like a free market approach, where it would literally be like, you might even end up with different tiers of doctors, and you would understand based upon the level of certification they've got through competency, right? Through some sort of practical test or mentorship, or again, apprenticeship, that they've got to this certain level. But anyways, we'll keep rolling here. And the next story I want to jump into, this one was definitely lighting up the Twitter timeline yesterday. Pfizer admits COVID vaccine was never tested for transmission. Now, the exact language in the video I'm about to play for you, I wish that the Pfizer's rep would have responded slightly different. I still don't feel like she completely answered the question the way it was framed. But let's play the video first, and then I'll highlight exactly what I mean. And again, this is very interesting, if nothing else.
If you don't get vaccinated, you're antisocial. This is what the Dutch Prime Minister and Health Minister told us. You don't get vaccinated just for yourself, but also for others. You do it for all of society. That's what I said. Today, this turned out to be complete nonsense. In a COVID hearing in the European Parliament, one of the Pfizer directors just admitted to me, at the time of introduction, the vaccine had never been tested on stopping the transmission of the virus. This removes the entire legal basis for the COVID passport. The COVID passport that led to massive institutional discrimination as people lost access to essential parts of society. I find this to be shocking, even criminal. Please watch the video until the end.
Voor u, mevrouw Small, heb ik de volgende vraag waar ik een duidelijk antwoord op wil. And I will speak in English so there are no misunderstandings. Was the Pfizer COVID vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market? If not, please say it clearly. If yes, are you willing to share the data with this committee? And I really want a straight answer, yes or no, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Regarding the question around, did we know about stopping immunisation before it's entered the market? No. We had to really move at the speed of science to really understand what is taking place in the market.
This is scandalous. Millions of people worldwide.
So I'll leave it there. But one, the way she framed it, did we know about immunization? She wasn't like, I wish she would have used the word transmission, because that would have been very clear. Where I think that we'll see some political pundits push back and be like, well, she was kind of talking about something differently, even though he essentially begged her for the clearest like answer possible on this. I do find there to be something particularly hubris about her saying we were moving at the speed of science, right? Like, it literally feels like now science is a word that, as long as you're in alignment with mainstream media and mainstream politicians, you can hold up that shield and it protects you from any and all fault. What are your thoughts here, Adam? And had you seen this video making the rounds yesterday?
Yeah, I absolutely saw that video, and I was actually skeptical when I first clicked the link, and then after I watched her just clearly say what she said, I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, obviously I wasn't surprised by that statement, because the speed of science is, of course, comes with no legal liability if there was any harm or damage done to the people that took the vaccine. And so why not push it out as soon as possible to the market? And I guess the thing that is most upsetting to me is that this treatment, whatever you want to call it, was essentially mandated here in our country. Like, they can say it was voluntary to get it however much they want. When you take away people's jobs, when you take away their ability to travel, when you limit the services that they have access to in the country, you're mandating it, you're forcing it. And not being allowed in restaurants, I know just anecdotally lots of people that were forced to essentially leave their job or be subject to testing. And yeah, I mean, pushing drugs out that haven't been tested, it's not good. You can even listen to Dr. Fauci himself talk to you about that. There's many videos of him out there saying that you could not possibly rush something this fast. And then, out of the other side of his mouth, he said we had to do this as fast as possible and we could skip all these tests and it wasn't going to matter because it's safe and effective and it's going to stop transmission. And that was the message all along. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it certainly is frustrating, if nothing else, for any of us that have a memory, because a lot of us remember what the original narrative was, right? The original narrative essentially pushed through mainstream media as well as by politicians was the concept that if you get the shot, you won't get sick. And then even if you do get sick, it's going to be less severe. And it's also going to reduce transmission, and thus the justification between things like the COVID passport, right? Or the vaccine passports that we saw rolled out across multiple nations in Western society. And here we are, where at this moment in time, essentially based upon like Pfizer themselves, based upon the science as it's coming out these days, we find out that essentially none of those claims were originally true. And what really frustrates me is the fact that we already know that these pharmaceutical companies have a blanket shield, right, where they're not going to be held responsible in any way for any of the consequences of it. Politicians won't be held responsible, and the mainstream media won't be held responsible either. Now, again, I don't think there was anything wrong with moving really fast and getting these vaccines out. In fact, like, I'm okay with that. It's the moment you start to try and mandate it, as you were saying, Adam, the moment you start to try and have carrots and sticks in regards to influencing people's decisions rather than them just letting them make their own decisions, right? We also covered earlier on in the week, right, how now we've got the Florida Surgeon General saying it's not recommended for males between the ages of 18 and 39. And yet for the longest time, we were told this is the most safe, most effective manner we have to fight the virus, to fight the pandemic. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm too black-pilled here, but if it does ever happen, I look forward to the day where Justin Trudeau sits in front of a hearing or investigation and has to admit that he was wrong on this. I don't even care if there's real consequences to it at this point in time. It would just be refreshing to actually hear our prime minister state reality for once, just point blank, what the facts on the ground are. I do think that a lot of this information, as it continues to come out piecemeal, will erode the narrative of them taking the safety first position in regards to mandating vaccines. And I suspect that we won't see the same sort of tyranny that we've experienced play out here in Canada again in relation to COVID. Now, again, the next time there's a virus, whether that's like avian flu or something else, who knows, right? All bets are off, because I think they'll take this time it's different perspective, just like they did during COVID. Anything else on this and Pfizer you want to cover, Adam, before we move on?
No, I need a barf bag to go on any further on this topic.
All right. Well, the last I want to explore with you guys. This one is via Zero Hedge. And this one honestly didn't get as much attention as I think it should. Now, there's a little bit of like inference that's necessary in order to really jump to conclusions on this, but I find this to be a really big deal. And that was the Bank of England's statements yesterday. So, is this the real driver behind the Bank of England's high risk game of chicken with markets? So, we've talked about previously on the show, right? Bank of England was very quick to move and pivot from their quantitative tightening and interest rate increases to easing things out of fear that they were going to essentially like cause a major recession or greater financial consequences in their economy. We saw the British pound, right, eroding in value compared to the US dollar. And like just kind of tangentially speaking, we've also talked about Credit Suisse. Yesterday, this isn't a story we're going to cover, but we saw a quick $3.1 billion credit swap between the United States and Switzerland, again, presumably related to some of the solvency issues around Credit Suisse. And we've talked about it previously, but if Credit Suisse was to fall, understand it is much larger than like a Lehman Brothers. So presumably there'd be much greater consequences to the global economy than even what we experienced throughout 2007 and 2009 during the great credit crunch. But I think, okay, maybe it's not exactly highlighted here, but what I really wanted to highlight was essentially we had the Bank of England signaling to bankers they had 3 days, right? These insurance companies had 3 days to get their shit in order. Now, that sounded very apocalyptic to me. Like it literally sounded like they were saying like, hey, in 3 days the market's going to tank, because what their main point here was that these emergency measures are meant to be temporary due to emergencies, that these aren't going to become permanent fixtures in our economy. And yet we see the entire market reacting to things like quantitative easing as if that's a new permanent feature, right? As in like negative real interest rates just being the new normal here. And arguably it kind of has since the credit crunch occurred back in 2007, 2009. But it seems like maybe finally the consequences of some of those policies decisions made over a decade ago are like these chickens are finally coming home to roost. What are your thoughts here, Adam? And have you gone down this rabbit hole?
No, I haven't gone all the way down here, but I did see that message from the Bank of England yesterday where they literally were like, you have 3 days to figure out your shit. Like that wasn't their exact language, but they said you have 3 days to figure everything out is I think exactly what they said. And like that to me, I'm just like, wait, 3 days to do what? How much damage control do we need to do in 3 days? And is this possible? So definitely interesting. And you just mentioned Credit Suisse, and I think they have roughly 4 times the value of assets or whatever under management that the Lehman Brothers had. So just for context of the size of, potential issue there. So yeah, I mean, interesting article. I'm definitely interested to see where that's going to go. It was another thing that was really interesting was watching the British sterling pound just fall down. Like I think it's at its lowest that it's been in a very, very, very long time when we're comparing it against the US dollar. So yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball on this stuff, but it doesn't look promising.
And like again, one of the aspects of this story that I don't see regularly being discussed is the real implications towards like the bond markets, right? So I think it was it yesterday or 2 days ago that the Bank of Japan for 3 days hadn't moved any of their bonds, right? I think it was the 10 years, which is just interesting in and of itself. But understand, like with Credit Suisse, with the government debt we see playing out right now, there's a huge I guess reinterpretation of like the entire pension funds, right, and insurance companies in regards to how they manage their books, how they manage risk, and how they manage the assets that they actually have under management. And it just feels like we are in that moment in time where we're between a rock and a hard place in regards to making some of these decisions. I don't think there's a silver bullet. So I know one of the things that some people push back on is like, well, what's your policy, what's your policy prescription in order to solve the situation we currently find ourselves in? And short of a time machine in order to fix all this shit, and that would require going back decades in time, I don't think there is. But I think that there are ways that we can maybe try and soften or manage the blows, or we can choose to just rip that fucking Band-Aid off, let the financial system completely collapse, and try and pick up the shambles afterwards. And right now, it kind of feels like we might be playing out towards the latter, particularly when we consider other factors, right? Like the conflict in Ukraine. One of the stories we didn't get really a chance to dive deep into today is Putin just put in charge a new general, right? In charge of the Ukrainian front. And I forget exactly what his nickname is, but it is not a pleasant nickname that they've associated him with. And it's very hard for me in this moment in time to try and make the bull case, right? The Putin's new Ukraine commander was dubbed the General Armageddon because of his ruthless track record with Syria back in 2017. So again, it's hard for me these days to want to really try and make a bull case for where we find ourselves in. Again, I do see some slight signals that maybe it's not as bad as I'm making it out to be, or as maybe it's not as bad as some of the financial journalism we've shared with you guys up until this point in time make it out to be. But I think that as I continue to just try and stack evidence on both sides of the equation, I continuously find myself with a much greater volume of data related to the bear case versus the bull case.
Yeah, I could definitely get behind you there. But the good news is, Matt, we've got permission now from Greta Thunberg to keep the nuclear plants going in Germany. So that's great. Now maybe we can at least be sensible and not try and get all of our power from coal, because Greta said so.
I haven't fact checked this, but my understanding is I think it was Germany, but maybe it was the European Union, has invested over $500 million over the last few years, right, into green energy initiatives. And I saw a political pundit state this. Again, I haven't fact checked it, but he stated that had they invested that in nuclear, Germany would actually be energy independent versus finding themselves essentially in the situation they are right now. And again, like, if I take the climate crisis at face value based upon the mainstream narrative, I still think that a lot of these transitioning energy sources like nuclear, like natural gas, are the path towards the future that these individuals at least claim they want to build. And yet when you actually look at the policies that they prescribe and try and push for, they never seem to actually embrace these transitioning energy steps. And to me, it seems like they've taken a black and white, very binary perspective in regards to energy. It's either it has to be completely holier than thou, the purest of pure energy, or it's, the devil's energy and you're not allowed to do anything associated with it. And it turns out there's real consequences in the real world to making some of these decisions. And it sometimes takes a while, especially in complex systems, for us to really see the degradation. I think big, behemoth complex systems can run for an extended period of time, just like the Wile E. Coyote when he runs off a cliff. For a while there, he doesn't even notice that he's actually gone off the cliff yet. But there becomes a moment in time where reality catches up, where, the laws of physics catch up to Wile E. Coyote. And I think that we're starting to see them catch up to our economic system here, not just in Canada, not just in the US or North America, but across the Western civilized world. It's shocking to me to see this playing out in real time. And I guess that's all I got to say. I'll try and pause the doom and gloom here. In the second half of the show, we're going to be jumping into the fourth turning, which I'm really excited to have this conversation with you guys. I feel like a lot of people have stumbled across aspects of the fourth turning, but I believe that actually very few people have spent the time and due diligence to read up on it, to look at what Howe and Stauss were proposing in their two books, right? The first one, I forget the exact title, but something to do with generational theory. And then the second one, obviously, being the fourth turning. So we're going to get deep into that. Rather than focusing on a lot of the minutia around the discussions they have in those books, we're really going to view it through the lens of so what? What are the actual implications if the fourth turning proves out to be a valid thesis in regards to macroeconomic trends?
Yeah, I'm definitely excited for that. And I guess we should wrap this show up now with just a quick tip or update. And so my update for you guys is I've actually been consistently now following all of the guidelines in the sleep talk that we did. So I've been limiting my caffeine for at least 120 minutes, which is a little bit more even than what he suggests. So 120 minutes up after I've been awake. I've been limiting my bright lights and anything like that in the evening. And I've actually been taking cold showers every day. So just a quick update for you guys. it feels amazing. I literally am sleeping so well and I feel so energized throughout the day, and I'm not experiencing any types of crashing or anything like that. Not that I ever particularly was suffering from that, but I'm certainly having a fantastic experience with it. So really, I really hope that if you guys didn't watch the sleep episode, you'll go back and watch that on Rumble or YouTube or on Spotify. We're everywhere for you guys. And the detailed notes, again, are of course posted for you on Substack. So if you guys want to read through these notes and the show notes of the show we're about to talk, Matt, I saw sent them out last night for this. So Substack's got you covered. It's got all of our detailed notes there, and you can read away. And one more piece of content recommendation before I hand this off to Matt for a quick update is Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard was just on Joe Rogan Experience, and it was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed that podcast, and I think that you guys might be able to get something out of it. They do actually talk about some of the things regarding energy and just some more political updates about things that are going on in the United States. So really great episode of Joe Rogan Experience. So Matt, do you have any updates for us?
I guess just first on the Tulsi news, I didn't realize she was on Joe Rogan. I assumed that was kind of like part and parcel with her big announcement, right? That she was leaving the Democratic Party, and she essentially denounced them and encouraged other Democrats that feel similarly to speak out and try and really enact change. So I look forward to that discussion. I've only kind of tangentially researched her, and I guess the biggest thing that's unfortunate about her previous decisions, in my opinion, was that she decided to back Joe Biden once it was decided like she wasn't going to win the primaries in regards to the Democratic nomination. But I definitely look forward to checking out that Joe Rogan episode. As far as like quick tips or updates from me, I haven't been enacting too many of the best policies when it comes to sleeping. But one thing I have been half-heartedly implementing, and I'm looking to continuously improve it, is really just trying to plan out and write out my objectives for the following day. I find that it's far easier to accomplish a lot more in a given day if the day before I've already kind of laid out a few things, right? Even if it's just as simple as like writing it in a notebook or whatever. Those few steps of just like laying out your intentions the day before, I think can really help you hold yourself accountable. So there's my quick tip of the day. And yeah, looking forward to discussing with you guys the fourth turning.
Awesome. We'll be back here in a couple minutes, guys. Talk to you later.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day, no matter what the weather say. Life is like a record, so just let it play. Educate, motivate, entertain and demonstrate. Health, wealth, relationships and legacy we elevate. Every day is what you make it, so don't take it and waste it. Never too late to save it. Remember, roses grow from pavement. Let me break this down in layman's. Just wanna live outrageous, build my way to greatness. Gotta speak my truth and face it. Hear the basis lies, gotta challenge it and break it. Take a shot of truth, chase it with some motivation. The best day ever, the best day ever. We gon' squad up, have the best day together. Best day ever, best day ever. We gon' squad up, go harder than any weather. What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play. Best Day Ever Media. Song by Dan the Lost Boy.
All right, guys, let's talk about the fourth turning. So I think probably the easiest way for me to introduce the fourth turning is just to share this meme. If you guys have spent a little bit of time on Twitter, I imagine you've already been exposed to it. Adam, have you seen this meme before?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So the concept here is hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And the general argument you'll hear or the sentiment you'll see on Twitter or Instagram or whatever social media platform you prefer is that we currently find ourselves in an era where we're in the weak men create hard times. Now, a lot of this is actually turns out based upon Neil Strauss and or Neil Howe's book and Strauss's book on generational theory. That was their first book, and the fourth turning, which was their second book. We're going to be mainly exploring the fourth turning here in regards to our discussion. But I guess a couple things I want to lead this discussion with is first, understand this is like a theory. So this isn't like a proven, this is a fact, this is a law of nature, this is a law of physics or anything like that. I do find it to be a very compelling argument. And if nothing else, it really is an interesting exploration of, do the times make the man? Does the man make the times? Or is there some sort of like correlation there in regards to it? So the first thing I wanted to share with you guys was just a couple of quotes. So this first one from Mark Twain: history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. And this is a sentiment that really hits home for me because it does feel like we can sort of see or observe certain patterns over the history of mankind, or at least recorded history. And then the original quote that I shared with you guys that became the meme, that's from, I believe, Michael Hopf, one of his fiction novels. I haven't actually been able to get deeper into where that quote originated. I suspect that it probably already existed, but that was the first reference of it I could find. So again, if you guys know where the quote hard times came from, let me know, because I'm just kind of interested as a internet sleuth. But when we're thinking about patterns, there really is patterns everywhere. And patterns dictate how most of us experience life, both in the micro and macro. Some common patterns most of us are likely familiar with are like the seasons of a year, right? So spring, summer, fall, winter. We've got the Pareto principle, right? For many outcomes, roughly 80% of consequences come from 20% of causes. You've got the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, so on and so forth. So both in nature as well as math, we often kind of find or discover or observe these patterns, and they often have really significant implications. And so essentially, Howe and Strauss, in their book The Fourth Turning, which I recently just listened on audiobook, it's actually surprisingly a very short book too. So if anyone's interested in jumping into it, I think it's like a 4, maybe 5 hour listen. So actually, compared to most books in this field, I found it to be very condensed. I don't actually think, though, that you really need to read the book or listen to it to get the gist of it. I honestly think that quote or that meme sums it up in a pretty effective manner. We'll share with you a couple graphics in this video as well. But again, if you guys want to do a deep dive, I encourage you. It's a quick listen, but I don't think it's necessary to truly understand what they were trying to lay out here. So before we get into how essentially generations influence each other, let's first explore like an individual's life, because again, there appears to be a certain pattern that your average human being goes throughout their life. This is based upon actually Neil Howe's discussion with Tony Robbins. There's a link in the Substack article, so if you guys want, jump over there, watch it. It's a great watch, in my opinion. So we've got the spring of your individual life. That's from 0 to 20. So that's the childhood, learn. You're in a protected kind of coddled phase, right? It's all about creation, being protected, growth, absorb, learn. Then you've got your summer phase. That's 21 to 41. That's young adulthood. It's often when you're kind of discovering yourself, you're testing your limits. So test what is learned, decide what you will value, time for relationships, kids, and family. And then the fall of your life season is 42 to 62, and that's midlife. So power and great harvest, reaping or weeping, time of power, impact, taking charge, unwinding of some relationships and career. Then we've got the winter, which is your elderhood. That's leadership. Again, mentoring, slowing down, laying foundation for next spring, which would be like future generations, your grandchildren, things of that nature, and clearing for next spring as well. So kind of preparing or laying the groundwork. Now, in the fourth turning, what they really explore is not only does this sort of pattern of 4 seasons apply to, the weather, not only, the weather, not only does it apply to our individual lives, but it also applies to like generational theory. So what they kind of lay out, and they get really deep into a handful of specifics that I don't think we necessarily need to explore in order for you guys to get the gist of this. But the big picture here is that we are entering a fourth turning according to them in their book. And there's something about that that just like rings true to me. And now a lot of their discussions do kind of border on being a truism, as in like it's something that kind of feels inherently true, but you maybe don't have a lot of empirical data to back it up. And later on in the discussion, we'll actually explore some of the main criticisms of the fourth turning and how Howe and Stauss kind of laid it out in their book. Because again, I want to really make it clear that this isn't guaranteed, right? What we're going to lay out here isn't guaranteed to happen. But when you look at the pattern of history, and when you think about that Mark Twain quote, it's really easy to think like, hey, yeah, it kind of feels like maybe we are entering a unique period in time. So Stauss and Howe have theorized one of the major patterns of life, which is a reoccurring generational cycle in Western history based on the historical generations they examined, as a 4-stage cycle of social or mood eras, or the 4 turnings. The theory states that major historical events are associated with these reoccurring generational archetypes. These generational archetypes lead to a new era called a turning, often lasting 20 to 25 years. And again, if you notice even how society breaks up the past, right? We break it up into generations. Usually generations do last kind of in that 20 to 30 year time range. And in which during each one of these like turnings or generational periods, we get a new social, political, and economic climate ends up existing. So what they kind of describe this as is a saeculum. And a saeculum is the length of time equal to a potential lifetime. So about 80 to 100 years, right? Which again, that's 4 different seasons, breaks in nicely into that 20 to 25 year time horizon that they kind of laid out for all of us. So when we're looking at these, essentially, there's a couple ways you can try to summarize these patterns. So an average life is 80 years and consists of 4 periods of 20 to 22 years. So you've got childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and elderhood, as we laid out in the seasons of a life. Then we've got generations, right? So a generation is an aggregate of people born every 20, 25 years. So we've got baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and homelanders. And that's what they refer to kind of the next generation coming up after millennials. Myself and Adam, we're millennials, but the generation following us, they frame it as homelanders. You may have also heard them referred to as like Generation Z, and there's a couple other terms that are thrown around. Then we've got each generation experiences 4 turnings. So we all live through 4 different turnings or 4 different seasons on this macro pattern. But what's interesting is depending upon where you are in the current saeculum, as well as like where you are in your period of life, dictates how you're going to experience that individual generational turning. And the way they frame this is those 4 turnings is the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis. And right now, according to them, we're transitioning from the unraveling into the crisis. And one of the reasons this book got so much attention when it originally came out and why it's getting so much more attention in the modern day is they predicted that by like 2020 to 2026, we were going to go through some really transformative periods of time. And so they predicted all this pre 9/11, just for context. The book was originally written before 9/11. And they predicted that we could see some sort of mass terrorism, as in like, and literally, I think they referred to planes targeting buildings, right? They also referred to we'd probably see economic instability. We could see like financial recessions or a market crash or something of that kind of level. They also explored the idea of pandemics. Now, obviously, all those things didn't happen between 2020 and 2026. However, we did experience 9/11. We did experience like the great credit crunch, right? The 2007, 2009 period. As well, we currently are experiencing the COVID pandemic. So there's certain things there that just kind of ring true that got this book a lot of attention. Steve Bannon has discussed the book. Al Gore has discussed the book. Again, there's been a lot of very powerful and influential individuals that have referenced this book at different periods in time. At the same time, there is a lot of criticisms or backlash. Now, A lot of the recent backlash is literally because Steve Bannon likes the book and has referenced it, which I'm not sure if that's a good enough reason to go after their concept here. But let's quickly explore those generational archetypes. So high. The first turning is a high which occurs after a crisis. During the high, institutions are strong and individualism is weak. Society is confident about where it wants to go collectively, though those outside the majoritarian center often feel stifled by the conformity. Then we enter the awakening phase. So this is the second turning. This is an era where institutions are attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy. Just when society is reaching its high tide of public progress, people suddenly tire of social discipline and want to recapture a sense of self-awareness, spirituality, and personal authenticity. Then we enter the unraveling. This is the third turning, and it's called the unraveling. The mood of the era, they say, is in many ways the opposite of a high. Institutions are weak and distrusted, while individualism is strong and flourishing. Then the fourth turning is the crisis. This is an era of destruction, often involving war or revolution, in which its institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to a perceived threat to the nation's survival. Now, I think it's really easy to hear that at face value and almost not even follow along with it or kind of nod your head along the way you would with truisms. But when you get a little bit deeper into the examples they lay out, this is what really hits home to me. So we've got, if we're looking at like previous fourth turnings, we've got the World War II, I should say, or even like the World War periods. But the way they frame it in the book is the Great Depression. World War II was the fourth turning that we most recently experienced from 1929 to 1945. If you go back roughly 80 years from there, you had the Civil War. If you go back roughly 80 years from there, you have the American Revolution. If you go back 80 years from there, you've got the Glorious Revolution. 80 more years, you've got the Armada Crisis. And you go back 80 more years, you've got the Year of Roses. I guess when I saw this laid out, and I think this is what really convinces a lot of people to start taking this seriously, is you're like, hey, shit, it really does seem like there's a lot going on every 80 years. I guess first thing I'd like to explore with you, Adam, is just, had you ever thought about this? Had you really ever heard of the fourth turning before we kind of brought it up as a subject matter to explore? And as you see this laid out, do these feel like some of those, peak crises over the last few centuries?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that these are, peak crises, or certainly crises that involved a lot of people, particularly, if we look at the most recent one there with World War II and the Great Depression, like we're talking about literally countries everywhere being affected by this. And I'd never actually heard of this book, but I'm obviously very familiar with that meme of the strong men create great times and stuff like that. And I'm very familiar with that cycle. I've looked into before, like the rise and fall of empires, but that's on a bit of a larger timeline, I would think. But certainly, even just seeing these ones here, like, God, I haven't thought of the War of the Roses for a long time. And so even just seeing these laid out and how tightly in succession they are to this model is definitely interesting.
Mm-hmm. And again, as you kind of like view it through the lens of generations, there's also something about that where you're like, ooh, maybe we do kind of like forget history to a certain extent every 80 years, hence being doomed to repeat it. And again, that constant Mark Twain quote is always in the back of my mind when we're talking about the fourth turning, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that just, that always hits so strong with me in regards to when we're exploring these things. And I just wanted to highlight here this tweet that lays out, again, kind of an interesting infographic chart sort of thing that lays out the different periods of time, how those were experienced, and the different generations that kind of were impacted by it as well. So I'm mainly going to focus on the more recent ones here on screen, but we've got the silent generation, right? The generation that kind of grew up during the Great Depression and World War II. Then we had the boomers, then we had Gen X, and then we had millennials. And that essentially would round out a fourth turning cycle, right? Is these four generations and their personal experiences and where they were at. And one of the interesting things that I'll leave you guys to do your own research in is how, based upon what age your generation is and where we are in the four turning cycles, how that impacts them, right? So you'll have different generations that will be more, optimistic, more pessimistic, those that are higher trust towards institutions, those that are low trust towards institution, those that prefer safety, those that prefer individuality, right, and risk taking. And again, one of the main criticisms you'll often come across in regards to the four-turning thesis is that it doesn't apply to every single person in a generation. And that's obviously true whenever we're looking at large bodies of populations, right? But there is that old adage that the exceptions don't make the rule. And that's what I really focus on is the aggregate here, right? Is there certain patterns? Is there lessons we can learn? Another great chart, if you just want to kind of explore further in detail the past and how these four turnings have played out previously. But let's quickly jump into the critiques of the fourth turning, because what I want to spend the bulk of our time on is actually exploring the implications here and kind of spitballing with you, Adam, whether those implications should impact us, whether we think that this feels in alignment with our personal experiences. But the fourth turning is regularly critiqued as being overly broad, not relying on empirical evidence, and not applying to every individual in a given generation. Many argue that other characteristics, for example, geography or political affiliation, have a greater impact than like a generational difference does. And again, that also does ring true to me, right? When we're thinking about someone that grows up in a blue city versus a red state, I think that those political affiliation and geography differences probably have as big of an impact as maybe the generational theory in regards to how that individual actually experiences life and kind of the roller coaster of life that they're going to go through. A couple other critiques I want to highlight here. So Frank Giannicola wrote an article in the Human Resources Planning that stated the emphasis on generational differences is not generally borne out by empirical research despite its popularity. And so this is, again, one of the big criticisms is that this kind of feels like pop science, right? Or pop psychology versus like them having tons of data. Now, again, you can lay out their generational theory, map it out onto different generations, and we can kind of see these different crises that do seem to play out in the Western world on an 80-year cycle. And again, a criticism you often hear is, well, that doesn't necessarily map on to every civilization's experiences, right? What about China? What about India? What about Russia? What about Africa or South America? And again, they really do take a Western centric and particularly American centric perspective on this. But that's also the society we live in. So it's the one that's most interesting to me and the one that has the most immediate implications for us as well. Another criticism I want to highlight is when you get past the rhetorical sound and fury, Michael Grunwald wrote in the Boston Globe, you realize that as a political document, the Declaration signifies practically nothing. And again, I don't actually really disagree with that statement because, as I mentioned at the start here, I don't even know if you need to actually read the book or listen to it in order to get the gist of it and have some of the big takeaways. And this to me is one of those things where even if you don't completely agree with it or even if you don't believe in it whatsoever, I think there is certain patterns that play out on a generational basis that still behooves us to be aware of and take into consideration whenever we're trying to track anything approaching a macro trend, right? Again, think about how the baby boomers influenced consumerism over the last 50 plus years. Massive, anyone that went to business school, you've probably spent tons of time on case studies and understanding how, as the baby boomers matured, our economy matured with them lock and step. And so again, just highlighting the last fourth turning, getting a little bit deeper. What were some of the experiences there so that we can transition into the so what's and how you guys can actually try to make the most of this lesson is the 1929 stock crash, right? So we had widespread economic hardship. We had the New Deal, which was widespread deficit spending. We had increase in regulation. That was during the time that the FDIC was formed. The SEC, we had dramatic increases in the income taxes, right? I think income taxes went from like 20% during the Great Depression to above 60% for the highest earner bracket. Then we also had World War II, which was a major geopolitical conflict. And the reason it's important to highlight this is if you buy into the four turning thesis, is understand that as they predicted and as the previous fourth turning showed, you would expect that in the next, let's call it the next 4 to 8 years, that we're probably going to experience widespread economic hardship. I could kind of make an argument that maybe we're already going through that with inflation, with some of the macroeconomics. We had again, the New Deal, widespread deficit spending. Well, literally every Western nation is hitting new all-time highs in regards to their deficit, as well as their annual deficit spending. Increased regulation. Again, we literally saw a period of time, as we discussed in the first half of the show, where we were locked in our homes, right? When you couldn't get on trains or planes because of individual medical decisions here in Canada. And then finally, major geopolitical conflict. And I think a fair argument could be made right now that that may even be playing out, or the beginning of that is playing out in Ukraine, right, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict we're currently experiencing. I guess just when thinking about our modern day times to the last fourth turning, Adam, does that ring true? Do you think, is there a steelman argument or a red team, blue team to make against this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of agree with these things. I mean, the things that you've just brought up, right? Conflict in Europe right now. We've got what's going on in Yemen. We've got Iran being very tricky. We've got China making interesting plays, right? And what's gone on with Taiwan and some of the things there. North Korea still being kind of funny. It's like when I look at all of this and then I start to see like things that like were born out of the original like war taxes and things like that during the world wars, like when that stuff starts and then it stays, I think that what ends up happening is we build this foundation of instability and then things layer on top of that continuously. And it's kind of like the Matt, you're a chartered accountant, or I'm not sure if you still hold that title, but once you did. And something that I'm sure you could share is like, hey, with like taxes, we never really take things back, right? It's like we'll create an addendum or some sort of addition to the tax code to deal with the issue that we can see in the existing tax code. It's like we never actually shrink things, we just add on top. And my problem is that it feels like a house of cards when we do that. And so from that perspective, I can really get behind the idea that like, yeah, like maybe we are kind of nearing the end of this cycle. And if this theory is correct, like, yeah, I could see this causing real crisis and creating real hard times. So I think I'm generally in agreement with this. And especially when we look at the timing of that 1929 stock crash and World War II and everything, like it feels right. Like it feels like a powder keg and the fuse has been lit. But I have a question. I'm not sure if we're going to get into this later in the conversation, but I do wonder though, like what does technology do to this type of theory, right? Like when we have such fast information, when we have the ability to almost like a switch, change policies or change mandates or change and enact new things and put them into practice across like, billions of people very quickly. I do kind of wonder what effect that might have on this and if it might not even shorten these cycles. But
yeah, and that's definitely an interesting exploration. I'll just make a quick comment first on your original point. I think when looking at like government bureaucracy or government oversight institutions, it's extremely rare, almost never in my opinion, that you'll see someone take like a first principles approach, as in like, let's start over and start from the bottom up and make sure that foundation we're building strong. In regards to technological innovation and how that impacts these things, there definitely is an aspect of that. I haven't gone deep down it, right? But if we look at World War II era, well, right before World War II, and if we group in the Great Depression as part of that fourth turning, you had the advent of radio telecommunications, right? Which allowed for broadcasting unlike anything we'd ever experienced before. We both saw, we saw FDR and Hitler, and to a lesser extent, Churchill and Stalin all utilize that communication, that means of communication, in order to really cause a lot of the volatility that was experienced in that fourth turning. If we go back a little bit further, right, I believe that you'll find that like the printing press would have been around the Glorious Revolution. So again, we have experienced certain like technological innovations that were dramatic in regards to their impact in like the macro. I think if we're looking at the Civil War, the one that comes to mind for me would be the advent of like modern warfare tactics, right? So that was the first time that you really saw like guns being used en masse in a large scale conflict. In fact, if I remember my history correctly, you had like Britain and Russia, right, sending over emissaries just to witness the warfare that was playing out, because it was the first time that we'd really seen warfare utilized in that manner during the Civil War. But it would be interesting to go back and see if we could almost peg a different technological innovation to all of them, because I'm not sure which one I would come up with the American Revolution. Although maybe there's something there to be said with like the French Revolution and just the idea of Republican states in the first place, right? But yeah, let's jump into some of the so whats, because I really do want to explore these kind of point by point. So the first one, according to Neil Howe, and Stauss has passed away subsequent to the writing of the book, so we can't like tap him in the modern day to get his perspective. But understand, a lot of previously successful investment strategies were dictated by previous generational social, political, and economic climates. And the big thing there is, again, understanding that during the individual generations, as they lay them out, you'll have generations that are high trust and high belief in the existing institutions. You'll have other subsequent generations that come along that have low trust and a preference towards individuality, right, and individual sovereignty. And the economic climate and the political climate evolves during those different generations as they kind of peak and fall. And this one really hits home for me. The idea that, for example, what we've currently seen in the crazy run up in speculative investments such as NFTs or pre-revenue business and crazy EBITDA multipliers was caused by previous economic climates of negative real interest rates. So again, as we said, during our like the previous unraveling phase, right, which would have been early 2000s up until kind of 2020, what we saw play out there was a lot of crazy speculation in the financial markets, and it's hard for me to not think that that was primarily driven by the consequences of those negative real interest rates, right? The fact that money essentially was free. However, if you were to buy into the fourth turning and buy into Neil Howe's kind of perspective on all this, we're currently transitioning into a different economic climate. And in the new economic climate, we're not going to see crazy low interest rates. And that's certainly something playing out right now in relation to what we're experiencing personally through inflation, as well as central banks' reactions to inflation, right? Earlier on in the first half of the show, we were talking about the Bank of England and the bond markets and things of that nature. And this really feels like, yeah, I think that, again, even if you don't buy into the fourth turning or that we're currently entering a crisis phase, I personally really still do buy into the idea that individual generations have a massive influence on how economic and policies and politics play out. Any thoughts there, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that the free money that we've been experiencing for the last while, I mean, interest rates were, almost nothing here, at least in the real estate markets, and the same for automotive, and any other type of consumer debt was extremely cheap, and that obviously led to inflamed demand and actually some of the highest real estate prices historically ever recorded, at least in our markets. And that drove like rampant consumerism that got a little bit out of hand. And now that that's turning around or changing, it seems ripe for a bit of a crisis mode to be entered, where people are going to run into real financial hardship, and that will translate into their social and romantic relationships and professional lives. And those have cascading effects. So I do agree that that is completely possible. And at the same time, your oldest generation that's sort of transitioning there in this model into kind of elderhood or late elderhood is going to be very affected by this as well. If there's any change to the social programs that they have access to, if the change to their cost of living changes dramatically, like I think that this is how it happens, right? It affects everybody. And this is perhaps, how we see this truly go into a crisis mode that then could transition into something better. Like, we've talked a lot on the show about quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, and some of the various monetary and fiscal policies that the government's using. And perhaps if they're able to really get a hold on inflation, or perhaps if we translate into better technology, like a true hard money like Bitcoin, perhaps this leads into a new high, right? Where we actually do see our generation, the millennials, take advantage of, newer, better technology and some of those different characteristics that Howe talks about as we enter sort of these different phases. So, yeah, I mean, very interesting stuff. And I guess one question that I would want to know an answer to is like, how could this go any other way? Because I actually don't really know how it could go any other way than into a crisis mode right now. And so I guess that could prolong this transition, but I do think we're headed into that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess like how this could look differently would be as if we remain with a high level of trust in our institutions, if we remain willing to make sacrifices for the greater good, if we're willing to continue to defer to existing authority structures, that would probably alleviate a lot of the potential conflicts that would come out of like a crisis period of time. So I guess just food for thought on that. But
one thing, sorry, Matt, I don't mean to cut you off, but one thing that scares me about that sentiment is what if we create that monster, right? And I think that that's perhaps one of the things that we did witness in, and I don't want to go down any conspiratorial paths here really, but, regarding like America around 2001, like they had a real and tangible monster to approach. And that was a massively unifying factor, but it also served as a backdoor for what, many would call the military industrial complex, which is something that I think would greatly contribute to the crisis phase. Right. And so it's almost a sleight of hand or a distraction. And I guess that would be one of my potential worries, is that like at any given point, any one organization, if they were large enough or persuasive enough, could create a monster of unity.
Yeah, so that'll maybe lead me down this tangent here, and we'll circle back to some of the other so whats. But I found this to be a really interesting aspect of the idea around the fourth turning, and that's the necessity of conflict. So if you guys will indulge me here, I think this is important. William James, and this is from 1910, in his essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, in 1910, explored the idea of whether we could have a shared objective that can elicit the same willingness to sacrifice and the same disciplined and purposeful ethos as a military conflict does, yet direct them towards entirely peaceful purposes. Can we sustain political unity and civil virtue in the absence of war or a credible threat? So kind of what you were laying out there, Adam. In the graphic novel Watchmen, which I'm a big fan of, Ozymandias, the smartest man on the planet, ultimately comes to the conclusion that the only one thing that can unite humanity and avert a nuclear apocalypse is an external threat like an alien invasion. And so those of you that are familiar with the book, it's spoiler alert, but it's like a 30-plus-year-old book, is the idea that literally they create a false flag attack on New York that appears to be from aliens so that the entire globe, and at this moment in time, it's U.S., and NATO, essentially, and Russia, decide to come together in a peaceful manner to fight this existential threat that's outside of just like, the whims of humanity. And building upon this concept of the conflict, this is why in the past we see so many wars announced by the state, whether it's a war on poverty, drugs, hate, terrorism. They're trying to elicit the same social habits the war does. So we've previously seen different governments and political entities try and create this moral equivalent of war, but try and do it through a more productive manner versus simply like a military conflict. In his 1906 speech, James explores the question: if you were to ask Americans right now in 1906 if they would have preferred to have not fought the Civil War, James bets that the vast majority would say that the Civil War was a necessary and without it, there is no way society would have progressed or developed as far as it has in 1906. And America would not be dynamic, affluent, and united as it was then in 1906. However, James notes that if you were to ask the same Americans if they want to fight a civil war now in 1906, they would all say no. Nobody enjoyed the Civil War, but it was something necessary for us to become who we are today. And that's one of the things that I think is a really interesting thought experiment in regards to those other fourth turnings that we discussed, right? Like, did we want to fight World War II? No. But honestly, if you were to ask anyone in modern day society, was World War II necessary? I think you're going to find the overwhelming response is like, yes, it was necessary. However, if you were to ask them, do you want to fight World War III today? All of us would say, like, no, we want peace. And this is one of the things that when you explore the idea of these patterns, right? And again, we see so many patterns in nature and just like the universe, that it's hard for me to not wonder whether these patterns are, predestined, maybe the wrong language, but just inevitable. And, again, it may not look like a carbon copy of the previous crisis or the previous fourth turning, but as Mark Twain says, it's going to rhyme. It's going to look similar. So again, maybe you can stretch it an extra 10 years. Maybe you can speed it up 10 years. But at the end of the day, it almost feels like this might be one of those growing phases that we almost have to go through. And well, maybe it sounds absurd, or maybe it sounds like I'm just rationalizing here. I actually found a lot of peacefulness in that sort of concept. That this is just like, the caterpillar has to enter the cocoon in order to become a butterfly. Is this one of those things where there's just growing pains to society? And if we want to continue to see society progress, it's going to have to constantly reinvent itself. And honestly, it's probably going to take a crisis or a major conflict in order for us to give permission to society to truly reinvent itself in a radical manner versus the incremental changes or the layering on the house of cards, as you kind of mentioned earlier, Adam. So I guess anything on that before I circle back to the so what's?
Yeah, I guess this is sort of along the lines of exactly what I was thinking about, and I do actually wonder what effect that has. Like, do states build themselves back better and more trustworthy, or do they just find different and more cunning ways to avoid scrutiny longer? And or even just if we're talking strictly with Howe's theory, is that they find ways to live another 80 years, but that those ways were never inherently better. And I'm a little bit, I guess I don't like the symmetry or symbolism or poetry, the poetic nature of claiming right now, like with the conflict that's going on in Europe right now, like, did we need to fight World War II? Well, from where I'm sitting, maybe, like probably, but I don't actually know. Like, I wasn't there. And I really am worried about how history will be written regarding some of the current events that we've just went through, like the COVID pandemic and like the conflict in Europe right now. And I guess I just don't fully understand, like, if you ask me in 80 years, did we need to fight this conflict in Europe right now? I'm not sure what my mind would tell me or how I would remember it, but as I sit here, I don't think so. I don't think this conflict is entirely necessary, at least to the degree that it's going to. And so I guess I'm just a little bit curious about this stuff and how technology will be used to expedite the process or lengthen it, and what different cunning ways, we will find as individuals, as sovereign individuals, to fight the battle, and what cunning ways that the forces that play against us will find to remain in power for as long as they do, right? Like, if it's on an 80-year cycle and distrust is the thing that transitions us into a different cycle, then like, what sort of tools will they use, right? Is it national cyber security and spying on your citizens and lack of privacy? Is that a tool that we'll use to get another 80 years out of this game? Or digital currencies, ESG scores? Like, to me, it's intriguing, right? And I wonder if we're any better off than, where America actually was at those times. And I mean, obviously we enjoy a lot of benefits. Like we don't have a ton of world hunger, or at least it's dramatically been reduced. We're relatively safe. We have a lot of luxury and comforts, but I wonder if these cycles continue, at what point do these things ever stop? Or is there a point in which society is happy with the product that it has?
Sure. And there's a lot there. I guess in regards to, does it create a better society on the other end of it? That's obviously extremely subjective, so I think it's difficult to accurately say that. But I think when you look back at like the last three turnings, so World War II, the Civil War, and the American Revolution, I like what William James was laying out there in his essay and his speech. That rings true to me, is that those conflicts, while painful, also feel like a necessity. And I think one thing that, like, not alternative history buffs, but those that maybe like are broader in scope in regards to their study of history are likely to come to the conclusion of is that like we've got this neat little manner of trying to oversimplify complex issues. And so a lot of people will say like America's been America since the American Revolution. However, I think those that are more studied in American history will say like, no, there's actually probably been like three American empires or three American political entities. And so you've got America from the Revolution to the Civil War, and that's one political entity. And essentially completely reinvented itself, right? Like you saw the suspension of habeas corpus by Abraham Lincoln, right? You saw really an increase in federal powers and a decrease or downplay of states' rights. And that's had like long term lasting effects. But a lot of people will argue that, you know, America right after the American Revolution, America right after the Civil War are completely different political entities. And like while they geographically, you know, maintain the same rough area, well, I guess it expanded post American Revolution, but like while it's still kind of geographically the same and maybe even made up of the same sort of citizenry, that it's actually like a completely different political entity. And the same thing holds true, right, in the post World War II era of where we saw a huge buildup in that military industrial complex, as you mentioned. And so I think it's difficult to give a subjective value judgment on it, but I do believe that we're probably going to come out the other end of this fourth turning with essentially like, for all intents and purposes, a completely different political entity when we're looking at the West or America. Now, whether that still falls under the umbrella of America or falls under the umbrella of NATO or under the umbrella of like Anglo-Saxons, we'll kind of see only with hindsight how the details of that play out. But that is really the way I kind of think about these things. And it's almost like, you know, getting old. You can't get mad at getting old. Does getting old make you better? You know, like again, it feels so subjective that it's difficult to really navigate those waters with any level of accuracy. So, again, I love this conversation and this exploration of ideas because it's so outside of the normal, in my opinion. Again, you'll hear people like reference the meme that I shared at the start of the show, but I think very rarely will you see people get in and explore the nuances of these. The next kind of so what point I wanted to hit upon here was in the next turning, your networks, relationships, capital, and reputation will become very valuable as we are likely to enter a lower trust society. So having deep bonds is very important. And again, this is something that, like, given my political bent and biases, feels like, yes, like that's just a check mark. I'm already bought into that. That even plays out to kind of why I bought and live at the Citadel now and things of that nature. And kind of to piggyback on that second point is my third one. Focus more on local, less on global. Ask yourself, are you in alignment with the community you live in? And so I think for a long time, as long as you were in alignment with Canada, that's all that really mattered, right? Like as long as you were in alignment with the average Canadian, it's all that really mattered. But I think even with what we were discussing earlier on in today's show about Alberta and Saskatchewan and kind of the splitting of priorities from these different provinces, I think that we're likely to continue to experience that more and more. Obviously, you see that playing out in the States, right, as well, in regards to red and blue states, Florida and Texas versus a California and New York and things of that nature. The fourth kind of so what point here is politics will continue to become more polarizing. Nearly everything will be viewed through tribal affiliation, i.e., it's going to be less about your arguments and more about whether you're team blue or team red. And again, that feels very true right now. People will be less prone to persuasive arguments and will become more entrenched in their beliefs. So it's going to be less about arguing and nuance and reason, and it's going to be more about like, no, I've decided I'm pro-choice. There is nothing you could tell me that will change my mind about being pro-choice. Or I'm pro-life, and there's nothing you're going to tell me or that you could influence me to ever make me reconsider my position on that policy.
Yeah, I mean that seems to ring entirely true of what we've been seeing, right? I mean, even myself, I've been talking about recession and talking about these things not being sustainable for over a year now, probably a year and a half, and then we obviously did just experience like true polarization of ideas without any type of room or to breathe or have logical arguments or at least critiques and criticisms of some of the mindset narratives that were being promoted around the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know it personally affected a lot of people that I know and our relationships with other family members or friends, colleagues. And certainly it felt very polarized and it felt almost out of control, which is the scary thing. And that's where I think you're so what, or your takeaway here, focusing on local and being in alignment with the community you live in, and valuing your networks over necessarily your net worth, right, is going to be so much more important. Because in a society that's losing trust, the financial markets will be, devastated likely. And so you're going to lose a lot of those, those beans that you have on the scoreboard. But what's really hard to lose is your network if you properly cultivate it, and the people around you and their mindset, and, the people that stay beside you as you transition out of that low trust society and back up to that rising society. I think that's like a truly powerful and meaningful connection to have, where it's very easy to lose money, right? I mean, we just saw Canadians, at least in our market, lose 20 to 25% of their equity in their homes almost overnight. And that disappears very quickly, but your connections and network they simply won't. It's much more sticky.
Well, yeah, and to like try and draw a parallel to the last fourth turning we experienced there in regards to like financial turmoil, think about the Great Depression, right? And there's those anecdotal stories of like the farm auctions, and where the banker would show up, right, and the auctioneer to sell off a farm, and literally the rule would be no one's allowed to bid on it except for the farmer that lost the farm, and they're going to bid $1. And that, again, really comes down to that relationship capital, right? Because those individuals were deeply tied into their local community. They're essentially able to create these social norms or this social pressure in order to drive that sort of response and reaction to like a bankruptcy auction. And
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, like certainly it's very interesting, right? And again, I can't help but find or think that we'll maybe find ourselves in a similar sort of culture for a period of time where, again, that very local network is going to be important. The final so what point I want to make here was in the next turning, with like this turning, culture and content is likely to become less transgressive. Culture becomes propaganda. Again, I think that it's very easy for me to naturally think of how mainstream media and mainstream politicians, right? And like you have to be on side of science and you can't question the science and all this stuff. But arguably the same thing's true with the right, right? Like there's certain almost golden calves that the right holds too. You can't question the Jewish state. You can't question, pro-life. You can't question, whatever their doctrine is as well. And I really do think that we're going to see a continued polarization, at least in our current era, our current turning towards all those things.
Yeah, I
So,
fully agree with that. And I think it's equally as absurd, some of the things that both sides hold as sacred cows, right?
and then just kind of touch upon, what are, again, some of the upsides of the fourth turning, as well as how will we know when we're leaving the fourth turning? So, how will you know when you're leaving the fourth turning and entering a new spring season? According to Howe, the climax of the fourth turning will not be subtle. It will be absolutely history changing. The structure of society is likely to change in a dramatic fashion. According to Howe, this climax catalyst is likely to either be external, which will unite us like a world war, or internal, which will divide us like a civil war. And again, right now, I still kind of feel like the jury's out on that. Is it civil war that will cause us to reinvent our society, or will it be a external threat? Right? Will it be Russia or China or aliens or a pandemic? We'll see how that all plays out. But there's definitely, depending on those two streams, it will really impact how society chooses to reinvent itself. Now, looking at some of the upsides, leaders are made in the fourth turning, right? So that's when you really see some of the greatest leaders of history step up, is during these crazy crises. As well, other upsides in regards to a fourth turning is our current biggest problems are likely to be solved during or right after the fourth turning. So usually it results in that climatic shift in society, which results in us either solving those problems or moving on, or like essentially ignoring those problems but moving on. Also, strong identities are forged through conflict, right? That concept of iron sharpens iron. And I think that we'll see a very strong generation come out the other side of this. We already went through the tangent, but again, if you guys haven't checked out that essay by William James, I'll really encourage you to do so, because it's so obvious that it impacted so much of modern day society, right? Like if you're looking at like Nixon and Reagan and their wars on poverty and their war on drugs and things like that, the reason that imagery is used is essentially trying to create that moral equivalency of a external conflict. So the fourth turning is not something to be feared or something that can be stopped. And I think that's one of the things that actually gave me comfort while studying all this and reading up on it is, again, like getting old. Assuming you believe their premise and their thesis here to be true, this is going to happen. It's not up to us to try and stop this conflict. But what we can try to do is prepare ourselves and position ourselves to either weather that volatility or even make the most of that volatility. However, we can prepare and position ourselves to, I guess I literally already regurgitated my thoughts there. The fourth turning is the price paid to enter a new golden age. And I think that that's another big aspect there, right? Just the same way that, like, for a lot of people, whether it's high school or university, that's sometimes uh, um, that's sometimes like the playground or the battlefield that you have to go through in order to reinvent yourself and reinvent your identity and start living more in alignment with who you personally are or personally want to become. And the last question I wanted to leave everyone with, and be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Adam, if you want to share. Have you gone through a hardship that caused a personal transformation? And then would you want to go through it again? And this really relates to that idea of like conflict creates the conflict experience creates this reinvention opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody would agree that they've been through some hardships in their life, and I've always found that I come on the other end of hardship with an absolutely renewed, a renewed fire, right? Like, you know, as the phoenix rises from the flame, like I find it always come out of conflict with more focus, more energy, more drive, more motivation, greater sense of purpose in order to get after that thing that I want to change. And like, even right now, like tonight or sometime this week, I need to like have a really serious and hard conversation with some of the people on staff for the one real estate business that I've got. And it's like, you know, it's not going to be easy or fun for anybody, but it's the right thing to do. And everybody's emerging on the other end of it a stronger and better person, having gone through the experiences that we have. And I think that every time, every opportunity, I think that you can have to go through sort of that cycle of, you know, experimenting and attempting things, but basically the life cycle that was laid out here by Howe, right? Where like you're essentially a child and you're kind of creating, protecting, growing, absorbing, learning. Then you test what's learned and decide what you value. And then there's a time for power and impact and taking charge. And then finally you kind of mentor, slow things down, lay the foundation for next spring. Like when you have that opportunity to go through those cycles on almost anything, I believe that you should. And on the other side of that winter, I guess you should say, there will be new growth. And I know that we've experienced this in trying to create different businesses. And even if you fail at something, it's really fun because you get to take the lessons learned and you get to take all of that new knowledge and apply it to something on your next project or your next business or your next relationship, whatever that looks like. So absolutely, I have found that to be true. And I think what I'm most excited for about this talk is something you mentioned there at the end, which is just like, it's going to happen, right? And so whether it's an internal conflict or an external conflict that does shape our society as we move forward, I feel like I'm doing the right things, right? And working with you in working to share our story and share sort of our takeaways with the community that we want to build here with Best Day Ever. And like, I believe that is going to foster the network that we will want and need as we transition and find ourselves in that spring. So I think we're on the right path, and I'm just I'm excited and motivated to push down this path as hard as we can, and hopefully people will join us and pick up on some of the inertia that we have. So I'm I'm just excited, man. And I think just the concept of just letting go of the fact that, like, you know, we're not, Matt, you and I are most likely not going to change the outcome of society. So I'm not making any Abraham Lincoln speeches and getting, change on that scale at this point. So it's like, we may as well just accept that we need to control what is within our control. And I think that's where I'm at. And it is freeing. It's freeing to understand that, like, it's just going to happen. So we may as well be along for the ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with a lot of those sentiments. I think, again, even just looking at like a smaller example of that, right? Like winter is coming. It's the fall right now. you can't fight against it. If you really dislike winter, you can prepare or position yourself to better weather it, right? That could be, having a big house that you can live in where you don't have to go outside, or that could be traveling down south to avoid it. But to try and literally fight winter itself is a truly fruitless battle, right? Like there's no point to it. And the last thing I wanted to leave you guys with is just a quote from Neil Howe in regards to all of this. History shapes generations young, and then generations, as they get older, shape history. And that's going to always be true, in my opinion. And that's one of the truisms here, I think, from the fourth turning that just are constantly ringing in my ears when I think about it. So a reminder, guys, you can find this entire article that we were exploring with you in our Substack. It's completely free. You can subscribe for free. We've got comments turned on for free as well, so you guys can share your thoughts, share your opinions. I'd love to hear your hot takes. I'd also love to hear if you've been exposed to the fourth turning before, or if you believe in it now. How are you personally going to try and position yourself to weather any sort of volatility or make the most of it? Because again, this is the era when real leaders are born. And I think there's going to be crazy opportunities for those that are willing to roll with the times.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I would love to hear. I really genuinely would love to hear from the audience. Like, are you prepared for volatility? What does that look like for you? What are some of the strategies? Maybe you're doing things that we haven't thought about. And in that spirit, I should talk to you guys about what we're going to be talking about tomorrow on Best Day Ever, and that is the Go Bag. So tomorrow is going to be our show on random hobbies and interests, and we're going to be covering the Go Bag. And if that's a term that you're unfamiliar with, the Go Bag is essentially a form of preparation that you can employ for, at your house, in your vehicle, on your person, in order to be able to be prepared for almost any situation in case there is an emergency or, something where you need to help others. So I'm going to be covering the Go Bag with you at length and in detail, and just giving you a little bit of my opinion on why I think it's something important that you should actually have, and why I don't think it's actually something crazy that, you have to be a conspiratorial, nut job or tinfoil hat to have. I think it's actually a very practical thing that you should have for you, yourself, your family, your neighbors, your community, and anybody else around you that you may run into while you're out and about in the world. The world is a volatile place, whether or not we're in the fourth turning or not. It's just simple that you can't always control what's going on in your environment, but you can control how prepared you are. So tomorrow I will be covering the Go Bag with you guys and sharing with you some of the tips and tricks that I've actually employed in my life, and the level of preparedness that I have with me on a daily basis. And with that, Matt, I think that brings the end of the show. So we'll see you guys back tomorrow morning. Holy smokes. At 12 noon. And of course, you guys can go watch all these replays on Rumble. You can join our Substack. We've also got a Telegram group where we do encourage, again, like Matt said, all of you to participate in the conversation. We are so looking forward to when you guys start engaging with us and talking to us in our Telegram chat and on the Substack. So until then, see you guys tomorrow. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.